So, that Riley Grace Rochon Demon Mama debate, huh? Bit of a shit show, right? I'm able to be topical and relevant, I swear. Howdy, everyone. For the 7 of you that are currently living under a rock, Calvin Gamma returned to the internet in dramatic style, in a spicy and calamitous debate with Goddammit Malcolm, who produces decent content. Go check him out here, link in the description. And in that conversation, they both debate the concept of transmedicalism, and what that word even means. Long story short, Calvin gets blown out because he's also trying to evade responsibility for all the bullying and stuff that he did over the past few years. But during the conversation about transmedicalism, he also tries to tag out for Riley Grace Rochon, because apparently they both have similar opinions. And despite apparently changing from his true scum ways, Calvin also considers himself to be somewhat transmedicalist aligned during the debate. And if you were in queer spaces on the internet in 2010 like I wasn't, you'll probably know a fair bit about transmedicalism online, and how it manifested in those times. Something, true scum, dysphoria, the whole 9 yards. But at the same time, that's not the be-all end-all of the discussion. While I wasn't as terminally online back then, I was sort of around in the LGBTQ+ area of the internet peripherally. I'd come out as various flavors of LGBTQ+ at the time. I had a Tumblr account which I never used, I knew what a true scum was, and I'd heard of non-binary at least a couple of times. And I also felt educated enough to have a few opinions on it at the time, malleable and tenuous and vulnerable to others disagreeing as they were. All that being said though, exploring my own internal biases is something I'd much rather not do publicly, so instead of that, I want to talk about transmedicalism. Also, this isn't actually a hardcore blood sportsy attack at RGR specifically. I'm just trying to poke a stick at the transmedicalism discourse until more of that juicy blood comes out, while also satirizing the blood sportsy attacks made at prominent creators in very simplified and essentialistic ways, in places where there's actually a little bit more nuance to be made. And while I still disagree with Riley on this issue, this is not a reason to harass or attack her in any way, shape or form, and I'd hope that you provide me that same charitability. So anyway, I fucking hate Riley. Modern day transmedicalism is a little bit like science fiction. Bear with me. Say you were reading a really good sci-fi novel you wanted to just gush about to the nearest person. But the nearest person didn't know too much about sci-fi. And you, because you have a tendency to overshare about things you love due to ADHD that went unchecked in your adolescence, start gushing, saying, "Oh, I cannot get over this amazing sci-fi book I'm reading." To which they'd reply with, "A sci-fi book? Sci-fi as in like Star Trek?" And then you'd say, Yeah, like Star Trek. And now you can talk about it with some sense of mutual understanding of what your book is about. Essentially, sci-fi is a vaguely defined genre, to the point where it's usually only definable by what we point to when we say sci-fi. And in a similar way, if you ask someone what transmedicalism is, the main response you get, other than,
Number one, I feel like the idea of what transmed means has been widely changed. Originally that term was literally just to mean you need dysphoria to be trans. And so my stance on that is different now.
Is generally, like true scums, people who think you need dysphoria to be trans. That's kind of what transmedicalism is. And to most of the internet that know anything about trans issues, that's generally the working definition and understanding of transmedicalism. And as a result of that, people tend to assume that the opposite is also true. That if you don't believe you need dysphoria to be trans, you by definition aren't a transmedicalist. Enter Riley Grace Rochon. Riley is a YouTube and Twitch streamer and TikToker, and a couple of months ago she had a bit of a kerfuffle with Demon Mama, where they had a discussion about broadly trans issues and whether having some definable way of proving transness in legal documentation is something worth doing. And the conversation eventually ended up devolving into how to define transness. Demon Mama was arguing that transness is something that can only be known through earnest self-identification, whereas Riley was arguing that there was some aura of transness inherent to all trans people, a common experience that you can point to. An extremely interesting topic which I have many opinions about, none of which I have time to discuss here. But spoiler alert, I basically agree with Demon Mama. An interesting dialogue too that came around every now and then during the debate was the idea that trans people have some mental processes that we all have that make us more inclined to prefer certain gendered expressions or habits. This is an interesting position to come to, even if it's one I disagree with, and it's not one which I'm trying to antagonize Riley for having. But the interesting thing here is that she attempts to deflect being labelled as a transmedicalist by clarifying that these mental processes aren't exclusive of non-binary identities, and that she's not talking about dysphoria.
Right? It's not saying that there's a binary, that's not saying that you need dysphoria, just that like there's something that motivates us so that it's more than just a choice.
This is an important clarification, and yet it still comes off just shy of what it's trying to do. Because while it affirms that she's not true scum, it doesn't quite do the same thing for transmedicalism. Not in the strictest sense, at least. And that's because transmedicalism is a slightly bigger, broader, less specific fish to fry. While it's true that all true scum are transmedicalists, it would be a bit disingenuous to make the same case the other way round. No transitive property here, good friends. Because transmedicalism is a lot less specific, and a lot more encompassing than just strictly being the idea that you need dysphoria to be trans. In the terminally online gender spaces that I operate under, it generally refers to some form of attempted, explicitly medical explanation of transgender identity. Whether it be dysphoria, brain scans, or turning gender incongruence into a medical disorder, as noble and enticing a goal trying to justify trans existence to people is. And for a while, I was attracted to the idea of being able to point to science and prove objectively that you're valid in your identity. But at the same time, this digs you into a hole where the source material for your existence has to be fed through the entire medical system for any societal treatment of your problems. And that means if, hypothetically, not talking about any real-life example of course, but hypothetically, if a government who had a vested interest in dismissing you as just another freak of nature that they can get rid of, they could just gut funding for the industries that helped you and people like you. And this doesn't even speak of the multitude of issues that arise within the medical industry that make it a bureaucratic mess which just so happens to affect members of minority groups significantly more. And if your goal is higher accessibility of gender-affirming treatment, as well as the normalization and acceptance of the existence of trans people, then just focusing on convincing people of trans issues on a medical or legal basis is ultimately going to fall short of that because of these inherent problems. It's not complete liberation, it's just more efficient discrimination. Back in the 20th century, being gay was considered a medical disorder which ended up getting prescribed treatment. Something that people at the time were fighting against, since pathologization ultimately wasn't the same as equality. And to be clear, it's very possible to ship of Theseus the statement, Riley Grace Rochon is doing transmedicalism. And with accusations of transmed, it's important to be really careful. If I called Riley a transmed and then explained my reasoning in a 10-minute video, people who don't have the spoons, time, or research acumen to watch the whole video would obviously just think that I'm accusing her of excluding non-dysphoric trans people, and then they'd either call me a hyper-woke vigilante leftist wokescold mob trying to destroy the left from the inside, or they might just take my statement at face value and leave believing that Riley is true scum. And that's just not true. It's all well and good tearing down other people for not being woke enough for you, but what do you propose instead? Well, while trans people being recognized as people on a legal level is certainly a step in the right direction, you could go a little bit further. Instead of settling for lower waiting times on trans healthcare, you could fight for a world where trans-affirming healthcare bypasses the medical system entirely. Instead of making confirmation for trans healthcare easier, why not fight for an existence where trans and gender non-conforming people can be taken at their word? A world where transness is taken out of the ICD altogether, and hormone supplements are readily available over the counter after a simple doctor's recommendation, just as they are for women on menopause and balding men. That's right, we're talking full-on depathologization. And a lot of transphobes would be pretty unhappy with that. But a lot of trans people would be made exponentially happier. And that's the world I think we should look towards building. Maybe in the meantime, the right, or the optically best outlook, whatever that means, is one towards moderate reform, where in the current day we argue for trans recognition on a legal medical level, look towards better funding trans healthcare to reduce waiting times and save lives. I'm not one to say, and I'm not going to pretend that I am. I'm not an expert on the global socio-political climate, and every government in the world and legal structure is very different. I'm just a person sitting here in an ambiguous place in the world, spitballing ideas that I think are good, and being cool while doing so. And if you enjoy it when I do this, please be sure to like, comment to let me know you like the video, and subscribe with notifications turned on, it helps out a lot. Also, feel free to follow my socials on screen and in the description. I also have Patreon, which is a way for you all to help support the channel by giving money to me. Anyway, stay safe, stay spicy, and as always, have a good